Hey everyone. Tonight we're easing into something a little different, but still very on brand for our cozy, mildly depressing historical bedtime vibe. So go ahead, dim the lights, fluff the pillows, maybe inhale dramatically like you're about to fall asleep in a Dickens novel. Because tonight we're heading into the gentle, soot-flavored world of Victorian clockmakers. Yeah, clockmakers. Not exactly war heroes or doomed monarchs, but honestly, their lives were messy enough in that very British, I haven't felt the sun in 6 months and my tea is slightly disappointing way. And as it turns out, being a clockmaker in 19th century London was not an aesthetic cottagecore fantasy. It was more like, congratulations, you now inhale metal shavings for a living, and your landlord hates you. So let's glide very calmly into the fog, into the narrow streets, into that weird mix of coal smoke, horse sweat, and someone yelling about fish. And let's explore why you, with your modern lungs and questionable stamina, absolutely would not last a single day as a Victorian clockmaker. Just float with me. No sudden gear changes, just gentle ticking. So the first thing you would notice upon arriving in Victorian London is that everything smells like the inside of an unwashed kettle. The air is thick, like thick enough that you could probably spread it on toast. People talk romantically about fog, but London fog during the mid-1800s wasn't misty or poetic. It was industrial pollution cosplaying as weather, drifting around like a moody teenager with no intention of dispersing. You're standing there, blinking rapidly because your eyes are burning, and you think, oh, maybe the clock shop will be better. No, the clock shop is worse. Victorian clockmakers were usually stuffed into little workshops squeezed between a pub and yet another pub. And the inside of these workshops, well, imagine the storage room of a hardware store had a baby with a Dickensian attic. Then take away half the natural lighting, then remove the other half, that's your workshop. A proper clockmaker, someone repairing spring-driven timepieces, mantle clocks, carriage clocks, or those aggressively ticking pocket watches that every Victorian gentleman pretended made him sophisticated, worked in a space about the size of a modern laundry closet. A typical day began early, very early, like the milkman hasn't even woken up yet early, because the wealthy needed their clocks fixed before breakfast, and the middle class needed theirs fixed before complaining about work. So you would be waking up at dawn, if dawn even existed behind the smog. And then you'd start your walk through the city. The streets are slippery from last night's drizzle, which is a charming euphemism for a thin layer of toxic sludge. Horses clop past you rhythmically. Someone tosses out a bucket of something you choose not to identify. A kid asks if you want to buy a newspaper, then follows you for 3 blocks even after you say no. By the time you reach your shop, you are already tired. You have accomplished nothing and yet feel deeply defeated. That's very Victorian of you. Well done. Inside, your master clockmaker, or boss, but British, waits. He's grumpy. He's always grumpy. This is a man whose entire life has revolved around gears and springs and customers who somehow broke their clocks by, quote, just winding it a little. He gives you a job, disassembling a carriage clock. If you've never seen one, picture a dainty brass rectangle that looks harmless until you take it apart. Then it reveals its true form, a mechanical hydra of springs, screws, plates, and components made specifically to roll off your workbench and disappear. Victorian clock parts had a supernatural ability to vanish. You lose one screw and it is gone, absorbed into the floorboards like a Victorian poltergeist. Your hands must be steady, very steady, but they won't be. Because it's 1847, the lighting in this shop is basically witchcraft, and you are running on stale bread and overboiled tea. Speaking of lighting, if you're imagining a warm oil lamp gently illuminating your workspace, please stop. Lamps smoked, candles flickered, and you, already straining your eyes, had to peer through a magnifying lens at pieces of metal roughly the size of a mosquito's regrets. Victorian apprentices frequently went partially blind by their 30s. That's a real thing. The eye strain was brutal. But did they stop? No. They squinted harder, because that's what people did before labor laws. You take apart the clock carefully, very carefully, and your master watches you like a hawk who's judging your entire life. There's an unspoken Victorian rule that you must never show signs of stress, even though your forehead is already sweating in a temperature that can best be described as ambient corpse. You manage to open the clock, and immediately a spring jumps out like it's trying to escape the Industrial Revolution. It pings across the room. There is silence. Your master inhales. This is the moment when you realize you will not last one day here. But let's be generous and continue. After reassembling the runaway spring and pretending nothing happened, your next task is filing gear teeth. Filing gear teeth is exactly as boring as it sounds, which is why it's perfect for a sleep video. It's basically watching someone erase metal slowly, methodically, endlessly. Victorians didn't have electric rotary tools. Everything was done by hand. Hours of sanding, scraping, and filing, while breathing in metal dust with a side of coal smoke. Delicious. And because this is Victorian London, the windows are closed to keep the drafts out, leaving you trapped in a cozy chamber of fumes that would horrify a modern health inspector. Another fun detail: the whole place vibrates. Not because they had machinery, they didn't, but because horse carts rumble by every 30 seconds, shaking the fragile little watch components on your bench and causing them to skitter around like metallic insects. You pick up a wheel, you file, you blink. Your eyes hurt, your back hurts, your soul hurts. Outside, someone is yelling about oysters. Let's drift a little deeper into your hypothetical misery. Lunch arrives. And by arrives, I mean you take a break to eat whatever sad beige food you brought from home. Probably a slice of bread with a smear of something that has the texture of old soap. Maybe a boiled potato. Maybe. And tea, which tastes faintly of metal because everything does. Your boss doesn't take lunch. He claims he doesn't need it. That's because he survives entirely on spite and the adrenaline of knowing he can fix a clock faster than you. This is a man who believes that resting is a sign of moral weakness. Once lunch is over, you return to polishing brass. Polishing is technically the easy job, but Victorian brass polish contained ingredients we would now classify under absolutely do not put this near your face. But you do, because the customer wants their clock shiny enough to reflect all the bad decisions of their ancestors. As you polish, you hear your master muttering something about how craftsmanship is dying, even though it's 1847 and people haven't invented half the stuff that will later ruin craftsmanship. He's just complaining. It's his hobby. Let's drift gently toward one of the most charming parts of the job: customer interactions. Customers came in constantly. Some walked in with the frantic energy of someone who believes time itself is judging them. Others carried clocks that smelled suspiciously like they'd been stored inside a damp boot. People dropped watches on the street, wound them incorrectly, or tried to fix them by poking them with needles. One man once poured milk into a clock because he thought lubrication was lubrication. The Victorian era was full of confidence, but not expertise. If the customer was wealthy, they would stand there and watch you work, right behind you, breathing loudly through their mustache, because trust was not a Victorian virtue. You nod lightly and say things like, "Yes, this will take a moment," even though you are internally screaming. Sometimes customers didn't pick up their clocks for months, which meant your shelves were full of abandoned timepieces, each gathering dust like forgotten pets. And just when you think your day might be winding down, pun gently intended, the actual worst part arrives: the public clocks. Ah, yes, the bane of every Victorian clockmaker's existence. Church clocks, town clocks, factory clocks. Giant, outdoor, weather-beaten monsters that needed constant adjusting because London weather took everything personally. If you were unlucky enough to be the apprentice sent to wind one, you were basically climbing a ladder, then a staircase, then another ladder, then squeezing into a space where pigeons judged you ruthlessly. And when you reached the top, the mechanism would be freezing cold, coated in soot, and missing exactly one screw that someone should have replaced in 1823. But you wind it anyway, because time must. Let's drift into that, gently, slowly, like a pocket watch sinking into a tepid cup of tea. If you wanted to be a clockmaker in Victorian London, you didn't just wake up one morning and say, "Yes, I'm ready to fiddle with microscopic gears for the rest of my life." No. You were usually forced into it by your parents, who were too tired to deal with your hobbies and needed you to learn something respectable. Clockmaking was considered respectable because it involved precision, patience, and the ability to tolerate endless disappointment. Very British. Apprenticeships began around age 12 or 13, which, if you think about it, means you were barely tall enough to reach a workbench, but more than ready to be handed sharp tools and told not to lose any limbs. You'd arrive at your master's shop with a little bag of clothes, some vague optimism, and absolutely no idea that your next 7 years would involve sweeping floors and being yelled at for touching the wrong screwdriver. Your parents would usually pay the master a fee. Yes, they paid him, not the other way round. Imagine paying thousands in modern currency so your child can work 12-hour days tightening screws the size of sesame seeds. Victorian logic was a unique thing. Once apprenticed, you lived either in the shop or very close by. Close by meaning a cramped room that probably vibrated in sync with the nearest bell tower. No privacy, no heat, and no such thing as sleeping in, because the master had the uncanny ability to appear at sunrise like some sort of punctual demon. And the rules? Oh, the rules. You were not allowed to marry, drink excessively, although excessive is a very personal metric, gamble, swear, start side businesses, fight, bring shame upon the shop, and most importantly, leave early. In reality, apprentices broke at least half of these rules regularly, except the leaving early part. No one left early. not unless they were fleeing the country. Your first 2 years consisted of observing, sweeping, refilling lamps, and doing what clockmakers called rough work. Rough work was basically anything that could be ruined without consequence. Filing down brass plates, polishing gears, sorting screws that all looked identical to your untrained eyes. It was tedious, mind-numbing, the sort of activity that makes your soul slowly slide out your ear. But over time, very slowly, you'd be trusted with more delicate pieces. Soon you'd move from sweeping to assembling escapements, from polishing to adjusting balances. You'd graduate from boy who must not touch the tweezers to boy who may hold the tweezers, but only under strict supervision. This upward mobility was glacial, but it existed. And all the while, the master clockmaker was there, hovering like a stern grandfather clock that had somehow developed sentience and a personality that said, "No one will ever be as good as me." Masters were respected, feared, admired, and also widely known for muttering things like, "They don't make gears like they used to," even when gears hadn't changed at all in 50 years. That's how you knew they were committed. Now, let's drift lightly, so lightly, over to the culture of timekeeping in Victorian London. Because it wasn't just a thing. It wasn't even a hobby. It was an obsession. Victorians loved punctuality. They loved clocks. They loved reminding everyone how punctual they were and how shameful it was to be late. Punctuality was a moral virtue. It meant you weren't chaotic or French. Public clocks sprang up all over the place, on churches, factories, offices, rail stations, and each one of those clocks needed to be wound by someone who would climb up into the damp bell tower and pray that a pigeon didn't smack them in the head at the wrong moment. Victorian workers lived by the factory bell. Victorian shoppers lived by shop clocks. Victorian landlords lived by rent day, which they tracked with the level of enthusiasm unmatched by anything else in their lives. And then the railways happened. Railways changed everything. Suddenly, Britain needed standardized time because trains kept crashing whenever two regions disagreed about whether it was 12:03 or 12:17. Time became industrialized, regulated, measured, precise. And who did that put pressure on? Clockmakers. You. Well, hypothetical you. Suddenly, you weren't just fixing a carriage clock for Mrs. Whomever, you were responsible for maintaining clocks that synchronized with railway time, which synchronized with telegraphic time signals, which eventually synchronized with Greenwich Mean Time. If you messed up, if a public clock drifted by even 3 minutes, you would hear about it. Londoners had nothing better to complain about, and timekeeping errors were the Victorian equivalent of slow Wi-Fi. People would stand outside your shop, point at their pocket watches, and say things like, "Your public dial is losing time, sir," while you stood there with the bone-dreeped weariness of someone who had filed 9,000 gear teeth that month. And the best part? Some public clocks were owned by private citizens who refused to pay for repairs but still demanded perfect accuracy. It was like a subscription service without the subscription. All of this pressure, all of this obsession, created a special type of Victorian personality, the timekeeper neurotic, a man who took pride in absolute precision and yet also knew his entire livelihood was a war against entropy. Because clocks don't want to behave. They never have. Springs rust, oils congeal, teeth wear down, dust creeps in like it bought a ticket. And you
tiny apprentice that you are, must fight this endless battle every single day. Now, let's float over now to something more delightfully grim: the health side effects of clockmaking. Victorian clockmakers weren't healthy. They weren't doomed like 17th century miners, but they had their own signature problems. The first, metal lung. Official medical term? No. Accurate vibe? Yes. Breathing brass dust, steel filings, and polishing compounds 6 days a week was a guaranteed path to developing a cough that sounded like a rusty hinge. Then there was clockmaker's stoop, a permanent bend in the spine from leaning over a workbench for 10 hours a day. You can imagine Victorian gentlemen admiring a clockmaker's craftsmanship while discreetly ignoring the fact that the craftsman himself was shaped like a slightly wilted question mark. And let's not forget lamplighter's eyes, which clockmakers were also at risk of. Early onset eye strain caused by squinting into dim light at impossibly small parts. Some apprentices tried wearing early spectacles, but Victorian glasses were, let's say, aesthetic choices, not functional tools. Imagine looking through two little magnifying windows that fog up every time you exhale. Very cozy, very useless. Your hands also took damage. Pinched skin, tiny cuts, calluses, and the occasional slipped spring injury, which happened when a coiled mainspring uncoiled in your hand like an annoyed snake. But clockmakers accepted all this with the calm resignation of people who had never heard of workplace safety and probably would have laughed at it if they had. Now, we'll drift now over to something more shady. Competition. Yes, even something as wholesome sounding as clockmaking had drama. Victorian London was flooded with cheap imported clocks from France, America, and later Germany. Some were mass-produced, which offended traditional craftsmen deeply. Others were just bad. Badly designed, badly assembled, or deliberately made to look more expensive than they were. Local clockmakers hated these imports with a passion bordering on poetic. They would rant about them like old men yelling at clouds. A customer would bring in a watch that said Paris 1830, and your clockmaker would mutter something like, "Paris, indeed, more like Birmingham with delusions." And then there were the shady dealers, men who bought broken clocks in bulk, patched them up with whatever parts happened to be lying around, and sold them as fine timepieces of continental pedigree. These clocks worked for 1 week, then collapsed internally like wet cardboard. Honest clockmakers despised them. Customers, however, usually didn't know the difference. So you'd get someone barging into your shop, slapping a Franken clock onto the table, and saying, "I paid good money for this, and it doesn't keep time." And your master would just stare at it with the exhausted expression of a man who has seen too many horrors in brass form. As you move deeper into your apprenticeship, perhaps your 5th or 6th year, you start understanding the psychology of clockmakers. Because yes, there was a distinct pattern to the kind of person who devoted their life to tiny gears. Clockmakers were meticulous, patient, secretly judgmental, prone to long rants about precision, emotionally invested in metal parts that could not love them back. They weren't chaotic like blacksmith.
Eyes unfocused in that slightly Victorian, slightly malnourished way. Because we're drifting deeper into the world of London clockmaking, specifically into the part no one wants to talk about, but every clockmaker secretly wrote emotional poetry about: the customers. Customers were the true horror of the trade. Not the brass dust,
Not the late-night repairs, not even the public clocks that needed winding during rainstorms that felt like being slapped repeatedly with cold dishwater. No. The real challenge was the people who brought their clocks in. Victorian customers were dramatic, easily offended, deeply attached to the idea that their timepiece had a soul, and absolutely convinced that they personally understood mechanical engineering better than the man who spent 30 years repairing these things. So let's float, quietly, gently, into the parade of personalities who walked through the shop door. The first category of Victorian clock customer was the gentleman who knows things. He would strut into the shop with a pocket watch he had clearly dropped down a flight of stairs and say something like, "It seems to have stopped unexpectedly." Unexpectedly, as if gravity wasn't actively working against him every day of his life. He'd hand over the watch with great ceremony. Sometimes he'd even tap it, as if tapping had ever fixed anything in the history of gears. Then he'd stand there while you examined it, offering helpful insights like, "It may be the mainspring," or "Perhaps it needs a little oil," in the tone of someone who thinks he invented oil. Your master, having the emotional restraint of a man forced to interact with the public regularly, would say something neutral like, "Indeed," while internally imagining tossing the gentleman off the nearest railway platform. But the call of commerce is strong, and so the clockmaker nodded politely while diagnosing the watch. Cracked plate, bent balance, dirt compacted into every part like the customer stored it inside a chimney. It would take hours to fix. The customer would sigh as though hours were an unreasonable time frame, and you would bask once more in the warm glow of Victorian entitlement. Then there was the widow with the sentimental clock. This customer was simultaneously lovely and mildly dangerous. She would bring in a mantel clock that belonged to her dear late husband, who had died, according to her, peacefully, tragically, suddenly, or heroically. She never specified how, just that he was definitely dead, and this clock was his legacy. Unfortunately, the legacy had stopped ticking. She'd clutch the clock like it was an infant, and she'd speak with such melancholy seriousness that you couldn't help but treat this clock as though repairing it might resurrect the man. But the real challenge, you weren't allowed to scratch it. Not even slightly. Victorian mantel clocks had extremely fragile finishes, and the older ones were polished with substances that could best be described as flammable mud. If you breathed on it too hard, the varnish would melt. So you'd take the clock to the back room like you were carrying a relic, repair it with trembling hands, return it, and watch the widow nod gravely as if you'd done something spiritually significant. She'd leave with the clock wrapped in 4 layers of fabric. You'd wipe your brow. Your master would mumble, "Thank heavens," and then remind you never to put anything on the clock bench unless you intended to polish it afterwards. But the Victorian customer who truly tested the limits of human patience was the tinkerer. The tinkerer was always a middle-aged man with unstoppable confidence and absolutely no mechanical ability. He'd march into the shop and say, "It stopped last night, so I took it apart."
took it apart. Those were the most chilling words a clockmaker could hear. He'd place a clock on the counter, except it wasn't really a clock anymore. It was a bowl of parts, a collection of gears, screws, springs, plates, and fragments that once had a meaningful relationship with each other. And then he'd ask the clockmaker to just put it back together again, in the same tone someone might use to ask for a shoelace to be tied. Your master would stare at the pile, then at the man, then back at the pile, then breathe in through his nose like he was preparing to meditate his way out of committing a crime. Victorian clockmakers charged extra for these cases, not to punish the customer, just to soothe their own emotional wounds. Now let's drift to something a little more chaotic: clock theft. Yes, it happened, because even in the 19th century, humans could not resist taking things that didn't belong to them, and clocks, especially small ones, were prime targets. Pocket watches were the smartphones of the era, valuable, portable, obnoxiously flaunted by their owners, and therefore constantly stolen. Thieves loved crowded streets, foggy evenings, and gentlemen who were distracted by reading the newspaper while walking. A delicate snip of the chain, a gentle tug, and the watch was gone. Some stolen watches ended up in pawn shops. Others were sold to shady dealers who refurbished them without asking questions. And some, quite often actually, were brought into honest clockmakers' shops by the thieves themselves, who wanted them repaired before selling them. Your master usually knew. He could tell by the fact that the owner didn't know how to open the case, or pronounce the maker's name, or explain why the initials engraved inside did not match his own. But clockmakers rarely reported it. They didn't want conflict, they didn't want drama. They just wanted to fix the thing, get paid, and return to muttering at gear trains in peace. While we're drifting through this small emotional storm, let's glide over to the unusual repairs, the ones that made Victorian clockmaking feel like working in a time-traveling emergency room for inanimate objects. One customer brought in a clock that had been sitting on his mantelpiece when the chimney sweep fell into the fireplace, causing the mantel clock to vibrate so violently that the pendulum dislodged. A rare case of clock injured by chimney accident. Another man's clock stopped because his dog kept biting it every time it chimed. A canine-induced mechanical failure. One woman's clock was making a strange rattling noise, which turned out to be a beetle living inside the case. The beetle had crawled in for warmth and spent several days wandering around the gears, living its best life. Your master removed it gently, because even he respected a creature dedicated enough to survive in a clock. Perhaps the strangest customers were the spiritualists, the mid-Victorian hobbyists who believed clocks stopped when ghosts were present. They'd bring in clocks and ask if the mechanism showed signs of supernatural visitation. Your master would assure them that no ghosts had tampered with the mainspring, then charge them the normal fee. Clockmakers were practical men. And now, dear listener, let's drift to another important part of Victorian life: noise. Victorian clocks were loud, very loud. They ticked aggressively. They chimed with the enthusiasm of a child banging pots. They whirred, clicked,
struck, and occasionally buzzed. People claimed they got used to the sound, but the first night you slept in a house with 5 ticking clocks, you would lie awake questioning your life choices. But clockmakers were used to it. They could sleep through a church bell ringing directly above their heads. They could nap beside an unruly tower clock that sounded like someone hitting a frying pan with a ladle. Their apprentices learned the same ability. It was a kind of professional narcolepsy. And speaking of tower clocks, let's gently walk ourselves into that world now. Tower clocks were enormous. Mechanisms the size of dinner tables. Gears bigger than your face. Pendulums that weighed more than an average Victorian toddler. Repairing them required climbing endless narrow staircases into dusty belfries where pigeons had more authority than you. These clocks were exposed to the elements: cold, heat, rain, soot, bird droppings, and strong opinions from the townspeople. They also had personalities. Some tower clocks ran fast without reason. Some ran slow as an act of rebellion. Some clocks stopped. Some stopped randomly because a gear decided to sulk. There were clocks that consistently refused to strike the hour, clocks that chimed at the wrong time, clocks that wanted desperately to be retired, but no one could afford a replacement. Repairing a tower clock was a full-body workout combined with spiritual agony. You'd climb up. You'd open the mechanism. You'd discover that something vital had cracked, rusted, snapped, or been gnawed by a rat with mechanical ambitions. Victorian clockmakers often kept detailed repair logs where they described tower clocks like misbehaving children. They'd write things like, "Clock continues to resist regulating, possibly spite. Pendulum, beating unevenly, appears depressed. South-facing dial has once again shifted, blames wind." These were serious craftsmen, but they also knew when a clock was being ridiculous. Before we drift toward the end of this part, let's glide into a quieter but strangely important topic: the class politics of clocks. Clocks were status symbols. Rich people wanted fancy clocks with elaborate engraving, gilded cases, unusual chimes, and glass so thin it cracked when you stared at it too hard. Middle-class families wanted clocks that proved they were respectable. They wanted their neighbors to walk into the parlor and think, "Ah, yes, this family is definitely not falling apart financially." Working-class families often owned one clock, usually a cheaply made one, often imported and always cherished. It was the heart of the household, responsible for waking the breadwinner, timing the meals, and reminding everyone that Sunday was the one day they were allowed to relax slightly. Clockmakers understood all of this. They weren't just fixing machines. They were maintaining the rhythm of people's lives, the tick of routine, the chime of expectation. It gave them a kind of quiet pride and also a lot of headaches. So as we settle into the tick-tock flow of Victorian existence, remember, your day in a clock shop wouldn't just be tiny screws and brass dust. It would be customers with fragile emotions, clocks with mysterious ailments, tower bells that chimed 1 second too early and destroyed someone's sense of order. It was a world of precise chaos. And we're not done yet.
So, let's imagine you've survived your morning. You've polished gears, filed teeth, gently massaged brass plates with increasingly numb fingertips, and listened to old Mrs. Whitwell describe that high-pitched ting, ting, ting sound her mantel clock has been making ever since she dropped it on her cat. You assured her you'd get it sorted. You lied. That clock is, scientifically speaking, ruined. But the day has more gifts for you. Because now it's time for lunch. Or, more accurately, you look at a clock, realize it's noon, and acknowledge that you could theoretically eat something if you wanted to. Victorian lunch for artisans wasn't so much a meal as it was a quiet existential moment where you stood in a corner chewing on dry bread, thinking about how your spine hurts in places you didn't know you even had bones. Clockmakers tended to eat near their work because the workshop was warm compared to the street. And by warm, I mean filled with fumes. Oil fumes, solder fumes, tobacco from that one co-worker who always smells like he spends evenings sleeping directly on a pile of cheap cigarettes. You know the vibe. Meanwhile, hovering around you is the constant fear of crumbs. Crumbs are the enemy. Crumbs get inside clocks. Clocks stop. Then customers come back shouting things like, "It was working until you touched it," which is Victorian for, "I don't understand mechanical objects, and this is your fault now." Let's move away from lunch. It's depressing. Let's float back into the soft tick, tick, tick rhythm of the workshop. Now, the actual craft of clockmaking looks very calm from the outside. Lots of tiny tools, lots of gentle movements, very ASMR, very therapeutic. But inside your skull, it's basically a slow, grinding breakdown. You spend hours filing one microscopic burr off one microscopic gear tooth. And when I say hours, I mean that Victorian time perception is strongly tied to misery. 3 minutes can feel like a week. And then, because the world is cruel, something always goes wrong. Maybe a screw goes ping and launches itself across the room at the exact speed necessary to become unfindable for the next 40 decades. Maybe the escapement you just carefully adjusted decides to jam because it's moody. Maybe a spring suddenly unsprings with the raw, chaotic force of a coiled metal animal and whacks you right in the knuckles. Springs were the worst. Every clockmaker feared them. They didn't fear God. They didn't fear the London fog or cholera or horse traffic or the absolutely unwashed state of every Victorian person ever. No, they feared springs. Because springs were unpredictable. Springs were violent. Springs were, this is a technical term here, jerks. And naturally, every spring-related incident would happen right when your boss was watching. Victorian bosses had one primary skill, appearing only at the worst possible moment. They were like mechanical gremlins with hats. Let's glide a little deeper into the personality of your typical Victorian clockmaker. These were patient people, terrifyingly patient, because you can't work with things this tiny unless you have the steady emotional landscape of a damp loaf of bread. Clockmakers dealt with clients who had no idea how clocks worked, which meant you had to maintain a calm, professional tone when someone told you, "I think the moon dial is broken because it's a bit cloudy today." Or, "The hands won't move. I think it's cursed." Some customers were so suspicious of mechanical objects that they insisted their clocks were self-aware, haunted, or politically motivated in some way. There are actual written accounts of people complaining their clocks were chiming at them disrespectfully. Imagine being a clockmaker and having to nod along like, yes, sir, terribly disrespectful chimes. I'll discipline it shortly." You could not correct them. You could not argue. Victorian customer service was basically medieval hostage negotiation, but with more cravats. Now, let's drift to the workshop apprentice, because in every Victorian craft, there was always the apprentice. A teenager who had been volunteered by their family to learn a trade instead of accidentally joining a street gang. Your apprentice is enthusiastic, which is the worst possible thing they could be. Enthusiastic apprentices cause disasters. They sweep too aggressively and suck tiny watch screws directly into the broom. They decide to clean things that should never ever be cleaned. They offer customers tea in mugs that haven't been washed since the Napoleonic Wars. They fix clocks by tapping them, and then tapping them harder, and then tapping them even harder because their entire knowledge of mechanics comes from watching their uncle kick a faulty stove once. And somehow you're the one responsible for everything they do. Victorian apprentices were basically emotional support gremlins that the master craftsmen had to pretend were real employees. Let's take a calm breath and wander into another corner of your Victorian day. Repairing pocket watches. Pocket watches were status symbols. Little wearable flexes that men used to prove they were important, punctual, and respectable. Three things they almost never were. Each pocket watch was a tiny ecosystem of fiddly parts. The gears were so small you needed magnification. The screws were so delicate that one wrong twist could strip them. And the cases were often decorated with elaborate engravings, which is Victorian for "the customer will scream if you scratch this even a little." Most pocket watches that came in for repair were already disasters. They had been dropped, sat on, washed, boiled, used to time horse races, used to time questionable back alley activities, and once in a while used to shoo away pigeons. Victorian pigeons were fearless. They feared nothing, except apparently flying pocket watches. So you'd open a broken watch and find things: lint, hay, coins, crumbs. One documented case, the remains of a Victorian lady's hairpin because it had somehow given offense to the watch's owner, and he jammed it inside to teach the mechanism a lesson. Victorian men were unwell. Now let's float over to the smells of the workshop, because smell was a major part of the craft. There was the warm oil smell, the sharper smell of metal filings, the vaguely threatening smell of solder, and that lingering scent of damp wool, because every customer wore clothing designed to absorb moisture like a sponge in a swamp. There were days when the fog drifted inside the workshop, mixed with pipe smoke, and created a kind of cozy, poisonous atmosphere where you couldn't see your own tools unless you held them 6 inches from your face. People talk about Victorian ambiance like it's charming. In reality, it was a combination of smog, tobacco, dust, and hopelessness. Great for sleep stories, though. Let's gently glide to the late afternoon hours. This is when repairs slow down. Not because you're done, oh no. Victorian workdays ended when they ended, not when the clock said so. But at this point in the day, your brain has dissolved into a soft, humming mush. You've been staring at gears for 8 hours. Your fingers twitch in little circles even when you're not holding tools. Your posture resembles a wilting houseplant. But you keep going, because there's always one more job. A carriage clock that needs regulating, a pocket watch with a cracked jewel, a tower clock maintenance request that you absolutely do not want to accept because it involves ladders and pigeon droppings and the haunting knowledge that the tower will be colder than the Arctic. Tower clocks were the worst assignment. You had to climb up rickety wooden stairs, open heavy iron doors, and then perform delicate work while surrounded by giant, medieval-looking machinery that sounded like it wanted to grind your soul into paste. Also, the bells were loud, like ring directly into your skull loud. Clockmakers learned quickly that if you heard a bell starting to wind up its strike, you had exactly 1 second to descend 6 steps, duck behind a gear, and pray for your eardrums. And honestly, most didn't manage. Victorian hearing loss was a lifestyle. Now let's drift to the softest part of the evening. This is closing time. You finally put down your tools. You blow a small pile of metal dust off the bench. You wash your hands, though nothing truly removes clockmaker grime. Your nails remain permanently stained. So evening in a Victorian workshop. You'd think this would be when everything slows down, a nice wind-down moment. Tools put away, maybe a cup of something warm, a gentle "see you tomorrow" as everyone shuffles home like tired chimney ghosts. But no, this is Victorian London. Nothing is ever that soothing, because evening is when rich customers show up. Wealthy Victorian people had one major hobby: interrupting the working class at inconvenient times. They would arrive fresh from dinner, which meant your hands were raw from a 12-hour day, and theirs were greasy from eating goose. And they'd slam a carriage clock onto your counter like it had personally insulted them, and then they'd say the dreaded phrase, "I'll need this repaired by tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning. Of course, no sleep for you. But you smile, because Victorian customer service required a sort of quiet, soul-crushing politeness that modern humans simply don't have the jaw muscles to maintain. Let's drift a little deeper into this nighttime repair crisis. The clock they drop off is always a disaster. Always. It's never something simple like a loose hand or a worn spring. It's always something like, "The entire striking mechanism exploded last Tuesday," or "My nephew tried to see if it worked underwater," or "A bat flew into it." Victorian wildlife was unhinged, and wealthy customers expected miracles. In their minds, a clockmaker could reassemble 1,000 tiny interlocking components in candlelight in a single night because they didn't actually know how clocks worked. Clocks just magically did time things, and you, by extension, were the wizard who kept time from unraveling completely. Let's settle into this calm, late-night atmosphere. The workshop is quieter. The fog outside is thicker. The sounds of horses and shouting and poorly tuned pianos fade into a distant, muffled hum. This is the moment the clockmaker's true ritual begins. First, you light the lamp. Not the big lamp, the small, sad lamp with the flickering flame that makes the shadows dance in a way that slightly shortens your life expectancy. Then, you take a breath. Not a deep one, there's too much dust for that. Just a very cautious inhale, like you're smelling something suspicious. Finally, you open the back of the clock. This is the Victorian artisan version of opening Pandora's box. Except instead of demons, you get gears. And instead of hope at the bottom, you get a single cracked pivot staring back at you like, "Good luck, buddy." As you begin the repair, your mind enters a strange nighttime rhythm. Clockmakers at night weren't quite normal. Hours of tiny, delicate manipulation under dim light did things to the human brain. You start counting screws under your breath. You whisper at stuck components like they're misbehaving pets. You occasionally zone out while holding a tool and forget what century it is. And every so often, you hear a faint tick behind you, even if there's no clock there. Welcome to Clockmaker's Auditory Hallucinations, a fun little Victorian occupational hazard. Some clockmakers claimed they heard clocks ticking in their sleep. Some insisted they could tell time just by listening to walls. A few of them believed they could sense when a mechanism was upset with them. Victorian craftsmen were spiritually exhausted. Let's drift now to the sounds of the workshop at night. The magnifying glass scraping gently against the bench, the soft whir of a newly cleaned gear, the oily creak of tools being set down, the ticking of repaired clocks as they test run like a quiet mechanical choir. And then there's the one clock in the corner, the one nobody touches anymore. Every workshop had one, a clock that was either too broken or too cursed to deal with, a clock that chimed at unpredictable times, a clock that hummed slightly when no one was near it. This wasn't supernatural. It was just badly engineered. But Victorian people were superstitious, so they all blamed ghosts. Let's step outside for a moment. Your workshop window is cracked open and the night air drifts in like cold soup. Victorian nights were thick. Fog so heavy you could slice it. Street lamps glowing like melting moons. Carriages rattling in the distance. Stray cats having profound philosophical arguments in alleyways. And somewhere down the street, a lamplighter is finishing his rounds. Lamplighters were like nighttime NPCs. Always there, always exhausted, always smelling faintly of oil and wet wool. Their lamps flickered, dim, shimmering in the fog, giving this London this dreamlike, okay fine, mildly hazardous quality. You'd watch it for a moment, breathe in the cold, damp air, then go right back inside to file down a microscopic pivot that absolutely hates you. Let's talk about tools now. Tools were the clockmaker's entire world, and Victorian tools had personalities, mostly bad ones. There was the file that was always a slightly too dull but somehow still too sharp at the same time, the tweezers that only gripped things you didn't want them to, the oiler with the bent tip that pretended to be helpful but was pure chaos, the tiny hammer that made you feel powerful in the saddest, smallest way, and the screwdriver. Ah yes, the screwdriver. Victorian screwdrivers were temperamental creatures. They slipped, they stripped threads, they launched themselves across the room like they were trying to escape. If a screwdriver ever cooperated with you, you checked the sky for omens. Let's ease into one of the strangest parts of nighttime clockwork repair. Time blindness. Not the medical condition, no. This is the Victorian artisan version. When you fix timepieces for a living, time stops making sense. You'd look up and think, oh, it's probably 9. But it's actually 1 in the morning. Or, it's probably been an hour. But it's been 7 minutes. Or, I'll finish this job before the evening bell. But the bell already rang 3 hours ago and you absolutely didn't hear it because you were inside a full mechanical trance. Clockmakers lived in a world where time existed only as something you manually adjusted. It wasn't real unless it was ticking loudly on your desk. Let's drift into something even sleepier: nighttime customers. Because yes, sometimes wealthy Victorians would come back at night. Not normal people, not sane people, but the kind who believed the world revolved around their elaborate mantelpieces. They would knock on your workshop door with the most apologetic tone imaginable. Terribly sorry to disturb you at this late hour. Which translated means, I'm not sorry at all, fix this right now. And you'd open the door and find them wrapped in layers of velvet, holding a clock like they're presenting a sacrificial offering. Some brought their butlers, some brought their dogs. One reportedly brought a live goose for reasons that history has chosen not to explain. Victorian life was chaos with good lighting. After they leave, and after you mentally process why someone thought 11:47 p.m. was a good time to drop off a chiming clock, you get back to work. Your hands hurt, your eyes burn, your shoulders are stiff from hunching, but there's something weirdly peaceful about it. The quiet, the rhythm, the isolation. Just you and the steady, predictable tick of mechanisms that only behave when you coax them gently. Clockmakers often described night work as meditative, not enjoyable, just hypnotic. Like counting sheep, except the sheep are tiny brass gears that hate you. And then finally, after hours of microscopic battle, the repair is complete. The clock ticks smoothly. The spring tension is even. The balance wheel oscillates like it's actually pleased with itself for once. You close the case, set the time, wind it, listen. Tick, tick, tick. Perfect. Or at least Victorian perfect, meaning good enough that the customer probably won't yell. And now, late at night, the workshop starts to dim. Your lamp burns low, the tools are quiet, the air cools. You put on your coat, stiff, oil-stained, smelling faintly of brass and wet smoke, and step outside into the fog. We're drifting deeper into the life of a Victorian clockmaker, specifically the part where we explore your social life, which is a hilarious phrase because you basically don't have one. But don't worry, we're going to take this journey slowly, softly, like a half-wound clock that keeps ticking out of sheer stubbornness. Let's float right in. So, you might think that after a full day of inhaling brass particles and filing gear teeth until your fingers resemble Victorian raisins, you'd want to relax with some friends. Well, here's the thing. Most Victorian clockmakers only knew other clockmakers. Not because they were antisocial, though, okay, maybe a little, but because their schedules were a bit like work, work, lunch, maybe, work again, panic repairs, more work, night work, collapse. By the time you got home, you didn't go out. You folded into a chair like a damp overcoat and stared at the wall until sleep finally took pity on you. And even if you did have energy for a social life, there weren't many good options. This was Victorian London. Your choices were basically a pub, a worse pub, a street gathering which was 80% shouting and 20% falling over, church, and if you were fancy, a lecture about something depressing. But clockmakers?
clockmakers gravitated toward one thing: the guild meeting. Which sounds impressive, but it wasn't. Let's drift into a typical meeting of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. Yes, that was the real name. Victorians loved long, overly dignified titles for things that were basically just group chats with snacks. But being in the guild was important. It meant you weren't a random tinkerer. It meant you were officially recognized as someone who knows about screws. A typical guild meeting went like this. You'd arrive late because a customer had dropped off a broken repeater clock with the energy of someone abandoning a baby. You'd hang your soaked coat by the door because it was always raining. You'd take a seat at a long oak table next to men with names like Mr. Farnsworth, Mr. Witherington, and Mr. Possibly Asleep. Then someone would read minutes from the previous meeting. These minutes were incredibly detailed. Item 4. Discussion regarding the correct thickness of the number 32 pivot screw. Item 5. Motion to debate said thickness further at next meeting. Riveting stuff. And everyone nodded gravely, as if the fate of the British Empire hinged on pivot screws, which to a clockmaker it kind of did. Let's float deeper into the room. Imagine the atmosphere. A dim hall lit by whale oil lamps, the smell of damp wool coats drying in the corner. A faint ticking, because of course someone always brought a test clock. A pot of tea strong enough to dissolve metal. Clockmakers weren't really party animals, but they were passionate. Their conversations were deep, technical, and nearly impossible for outsiders to understand. If you ever brought a non-clockmaker friend, well, theoretically, because you don't actually have one, they would fall asleep within 8 minutes. Topics included things like the moral decline of young apprentices and their poor screw thread discipline, whether French clocks were pretentious, whether American clocks were cheap, whether German clocks were somehow both, and the eternal debate, should clocks strike the quarter hours, or is that excessive? This last one caused actual arguments. Victorians loved arguing about things that don't matter. But guild meetings weren't just debates. They were therapy. Silent, Victorian, emotionally repressed therapy. Clockmakers didn't talk about their feelings. No one did in the 1800s, but they did express distress through extremely detailed complaints. For example, "Gentlemen, I wish to report that a customer brought in a chronometer filled entirely with crumbs." This was met with solemn nods. Another man might say, "The fog was so thick yesterday, I calibrated a clock by mistake, while actually calibrating a different clock across the room." More nods. Victorian men didn't say, "I'm overwhelmed." They said things like, "Yesterday I dropped a screw and didn't find it until this morning." Everyone understood. Let's drift into the softer part of the meeting. Refreshments. Guild refreshments were minimal. Some stale buns, tea that tasted like it had been brewed in a cauldron used for dyeing sheep. And if the guild was feeling fancy, a single plate of small biscuits that everyone politely ignored because nobody wanted to be the one who took the last one. Victorian etiquette was incredibly stressful. Now, the guild also did lectures. These were long, droning presentations about advancements in horology. Very impressive, very informative, very, very sleep-inducing. A man would stand at a podium and say something like, "I've devised a new escapement mechanism that reduces friction by 2/10 of a grain." This would be followed by 47 minutes of elaboration. Clockmakers loved it. Everyone else would rather eat the oilcloth off the table. Victorian etiquette was incredibly stressful. Now, the Guild also did lectures. These were long, droning presentations about advancements in horology. Very impressive, very informative, very, very sleep-inducing. A man would stand at a podium and say something like, "I have devised a new escapement mechanism that reduces friction by 2/10 of a grain." This would be followed by 47 minutes of elaboration. Clockmakers loved it. Everyone else would rather eat the oilcloth off the table. Victorian etiquette was incredibly stressful. These lectures were the Victorian equivalent of a sleep podcast. Honestly, perfect bedtime material. But the attendees took it seriously. Notebooks came out, sketches were drawn, questions were asked in that very quiet, very polite way where no one actually makes eye contact. Now, let's float into your personal life, the part outside work and guild duties. Clockmakers didn't make much money unless they owned a shop. Most rented tiny rooms above noisy streets. They decorated with practical things. One chair, one table, one shelf, and a single plant that died within 3 days. You didn't host parties. You didn't throw gatherings, mostly because the place smelled like hot metal. Instead, your fun was reading technical manuals or adjusting a clock you were not being paid to fix because you just wanted to see if you could. Victorian artisans turned hobbies into more work. They couldn't help themselves. Let's drift into relationships. Clockmakers had a reputation for being reliable, gentle, detail-oriented, and chronically tired. This made them moderately appealing partners, in theory. In reality, dating a clockmaker meant they were always late because of repairs. They brought home gear stains on everything. They occasionally mumbled about escapements in their sleep. They forgot birthdays unless someone engraved them onto a dial. And they often chose to spend romantic evenings oiling a pivot. Victorians described them as steady, which is true, just not socially steady. But you weren't alone. There was a whole community of craftspeople living parallel lives. Silversmiths polishing spoons into the night. Tailors stitching unstable seams by candlelight. Leatherworkers smelling permanently of cow. Shoemakers developing mysterious hand cramps every Tuesday. And watchmakers, your closest cousins, living the same tiny gear nightmare. You all nodded at each other in the streets like soldiers of the same quiet war. A war not fought with violence, but with patience, magnification lenses, and tea strong enough to reset your blood chemistry. And then, occasionally, rarely, clockmakers celebrated. Once a year, the Guild held a feast. And by feast, I mean slightly better tea, bread that wasn't stale, a roast, and maybe a pudding if the treasurer wasn't cranky that month. Men toasted the success of the craft. They gave speeches. Someone would inevitably say, "To time itself." Everyone clapped politely, and then everyone went home by 9 p.m. because they were exhausted. As we drift toward the end of this soft, quiet part of your life, let's settle into one truth. Clockmakers didn't choose this craft for glamour, or wealth, or fame. They chose it because they loved the rhythm. the tiny gears, the quiet ticking.